So, without any further ado, I would like to introduce our first speaker, who's actually a good friend of mine. So, Amy Brand from Digital Science. So, Amy joined Digital Science in 2014 as the Vice President of Academic and Research Relations and the Vice President of North America to manage the U.S. offices and develop commercial, policy, and research relationships with North American research institutions. But I actually know her before that. From 2008 to 2013, she worked at Harvard University, first as its program manager of the Office for Scholarly Communications, and then as the assistant provost for faculty appointments and information. Before Harvard, however, she held long-term positions as an executive editor at the MIT Press and as director of business and product development at Crossref. She was a founding member of the ORCID board and recently serves in advisory roles for key community initiatives and digital scholarship. So I'm going to stop there and turn it over to Amy. And Amy is going to talk about the demographics of scholarly publishing and communication professionals. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Thanks. So Howard was talking about, for him, the importance of the people in our community. And I think a lot about the people in our community, too, and wanted to find out more about them. But first of all, thank you so much, Howard, Melanie, Mary Beth, and others on the program committee for this opportunity. There's a bit of a backstory to this brief presentation. I had been invited to keynote the ALPSP meeting in London back in September, and I had wanted to open my remarks by talking about who we are in scholarly publishing, you know, the demographics, nationality, gender, ethnicity, et cetera. And I went looking for this data and couldn't find it anywhere, which was rather surprising. So I did what any reasonable person would do, and I sent an email to Anthony Watkinson. It was Sue Kesner who told me. I contacted her first, and she said, ask Anthony, otherwise known as father of Charles, who you'll be hearing from in a moment. And Anthony said, you know, I don't know of any data on the demographics of scholarly publishing professionals either. Why don't you call up my friend Al Greco at Fordham University School of Business. Al's research area, if you don't know him, is the publishing profession. So I reached out to Al, and he checked some sources and said, you know, there's nothing dedicated to scholarly publishing and communication, and why don't we do a research project on this? And what I'm going to present now is the results of this research project that we did. We worked with a colleague of Al's at Fordham, a professor, Bob Wharton, and we had the sponsorship of the 4 societies that you see listed here, ALPSP, CSE, STM, and SSP, all agreeing to work together on this project by graciously reaching out to their membership to answer our survey. Now, the first caveat is, you know, we're describing the world of scholarly publishing and communication, but mainly via affiliation with one of these societies. And that's admittedly not going to be representative of the broader library and academic community involved in scholarly communications. But I, for one, am really thrilled that SSP's mission and vision statements are now included of scholarly communications more broadly. And for example, 8% of the attendees at this meeting here today are librarians as well. So we're somewhat more publishing focused in these results. Some basic information about the survey. It was run by our team at Digital Science. It ran from mid-December to mid-January. The responses are completely anonymous. We had about a 13.5% response rate, so 828 responses from just over 6,100 people, 33 countries represented, and we've made the data from the survey results completely open. They're posted to our Figshare repository. So let's take a look at the basic distributions first, and then we'll look at some of the interesting correlations. So here's the nationality breakdown of our respondent list. 58% US, 29% UK, 4% Canada, 9% other nations. This is in part a statement about the industry, but also in part, again, a statement about these English language societies. In terms of the other countries, those other 30 countries, the ones you see in bold on the left are ones that have more than a handful of respondents, and the ones on the right are just the one-offs, or we had one respondent from each of these countries listed. Now, here's how our respondents answered on the question of gender: 63% women, 36% men. And when I first saw this, I thought, well, maybe this has to do with some sort of response bias when it comes to answering surveys. And I looked at the literature and found that, indeed, women are somewhat more likely in certain domains to respond to surveys than men. But when I looked further at some benchmarking data about the publishing profession, I found that broader surveys, such as Publishers Weekly, found that the workforce in publishing is, in fact, 74% female overall. So I think these data will probably stand up. And actually, it would be easy enough to verify them by analyzing, for example, membership data from the societies. Now, here's the ethnicity breakdown. We are quite white as a profession, even more so, for example, than the faculty population of Harvard University, which is 79% white. And this, too, is consistent with the PW survey, which showed that publishing professionals are 89% Caucasian. And the same is true for the UK publishing industry. There was a report a few months ago on the UK book industry that showed similar sort of lack of diversity. Danuta Keene in that report wrote, "Publishing recruitment remains dominated by Oxbridge graduates and unpaid internships. In fact, 10 years ago, there were more people of color in senior positions in publishing than today," which is depressing. Those are her words. And just to give you a little bit of further benchmark on this, if you look at the US Census, white Americans make up about 78% of the population. But looking, for example, at the 2% of Black or African American or Caribbean respondents, that compares with, for example, over 13% of the US population being African American. Turning to highest level of education, 39% master's degrees, 38% bachelor's, 17% of the people who responded have doctoral degrees. That's over 8 times the number of doctorates in the US workforce in general, according to the US Census educational attainment in the United States, which showed about 1.7% of the workforce with doctoral degrees. So we are a highly educated profession, and that's no surprise. Many of us love what we do because it keeps us immersed in the academic world and actively engaged in the research enterprise. Looking at years in the profession, this shows a fairly wide spread in respondents to the survey, with some concentration in the over 20 years, 29%. And you know, societies like SSP do a lot of good work to keep that pipeline of younger folks moving into the profession. Looking at age, somewhat similar, we see the highest concentration between 35 years and 64 years, actually including 85% of those people that have worked in the field for over 20 years are in that under 65. And this stands in stark contrast to what we see in academia in the United States today, with the graying professorship and professors, you know, staying in their jobs well into their 80s. So there's a bit of a contrast there. In terms of the organizations respondents work for, over half are from nonprofit or university press organizations, 22% from commercial publishing, and many, 15%, from organization types that did not appear in the survey-provided list. And those are really interesting to look at, too. So in this Wordle, for example, we see a not insignificant number working as freelancers or consultants, and others who work for associations, vendors, research institutes. In response to the question about job function, people were told that they could select as many job functions as apply to their career, and on average, people selected just under 3 different roles. So you wouldn't expect to see this percentage add up to 100%, those numbers here. Almost half of the respondents have held some sort of editorial role and/or management role in conjunction with other job responsibilities. And again, looking at the free text responses is really interesting. People mentioned R&D, advocacy, analytics, and communications, and consulting also shows up here. On content types, a full 84% responded they work with journals. 69% who report working with book content, whether monograph, trade, or textbooks. And again, the respondents could mention multiple content types. Services and databases were mentioned by 28% of respondents, and I'm sure if we had data from 10 years ago, it would show a huge increase in this area. And people also mentioned many other content types they work with: proceedings, standards, blogs, multimedia, data. So this is really good empirical evidence about how the record of scholarship is expanding and changing. And I think this data could be mined further with interesting results. So let's turn now to some of the more interesting statistical dependencies. This is the relationship between job function and education level. And you can see, looking at the green lines on the slide, that there are more PhDs in editorial roles and in management than in other job areas. This is just raw numbers. But 67% of the folks with PhDs have an editorial role, not too surprising. This is the relationship between gender and years in the profession. This is interesting. So we saw that there are more men than women, but here we see women trending in the opposite direction from men when it comes to years in the profession. So a greater percentage of the female respondents have been in the profession under 15 years as opposed to over 15 years, whereas the opposite is true for the male respondents. So this is evidence of more women relative to men coming into the profession in recent years, and similarly for people of non-white ethnicities. If you look at the Caucasian respondents in red, trending towards more years in the profession, and the blue line, the minorities, more people in more recent years in the profession. So that's a very positive development, showing an increase in diversity. This is gender in relation to education level. A somewhat higher percentage of female respondents have bachelor's and master's degrees, and a somewhat higher percentage of men responded have doctorates. And now let's consider gender in relation to job function. And here there's some clear differences. Higher percentage of men report working in technology than women, 24% versus 12%. More men in new ventures, 25% versus 18% of women, and in management roles, 50% versus 44%, where there's a higher percentage of women in editorial, production, and marketing roles. And these trends are borne out in the university press data that we looked at. We didn't have participation from AAUP, but we just looked at their directory, and we found there are more women in key management roles like design, production, and finance, but significantly more men in press directorships, 58% versus 42% of press directorships are held by men as opposed to women. Alice Meadows, who I think is probably here, now works at Orchid and is one of our Scully Kitchen chefs, blogged a couple of years ago about the relative shortage of women in the profession compared to the fact that we have so many more women and men, the relative shortage of women in management roles, I should say, and our data bears this out as well. In addition, our data show that men are more likely to move into management roles earlier in their careers than women, which is interesting. So it's some evidence of male promotion bias or hiring advantage for men, with women managing to work their way up over the course of their careers into those management roles. So that's all we have time to present here. I hope you agree that these data are worth analyzing further. Professor Greco is working on a paper for Learned Publishing. I think we now have good data on who we are in scholarly publishing and communications. We're a very highly educated bunch. We have a long way to go when it comes to diversifying our profession in terms of ethnicity. The proportion of women in top leadership roles is disappointing relative to the gender makeup of the workforce overall, and the same can be said for non-white members of the publishing workforce. That said, we're seeing a highly diverse workforce when it comes to the types of jobs and functions performed by members of the community, and in the increasing range of content types and modalities that we work with. So my hope is that others will make use of this data now that we've set it free in the world, and if there's any subsequent research along these lines, at least we'll have some existing data to benchmark against. And by the way, thank you to anybody who did respond to the survey. I'm happy to take any questions. So. Alice? We didn't really do any, we didn't collect anything that was identifying about particular organizations, so we didn't get that information. I mean, another big thing that was really lacking in this compared to what you see, for example, in the Publishers Weekly surveys is we had no, we didn't collect any salary information or, yeah. So sorry, we don't have that. Anybody else? Yeah. Hey, Lois.
How are you going to disseminate this information? For instance, are you going to be sending it to directors of publishing programs to see if we can do something about changing some of the balances of gender and
Yeah. So, yeah, well, one of the things that Al had thought would be really interesting to do, and we just had a very preliminary conversation about it, he's working on this paper for Learned Publishing, and the data itself are openly available. But I think once the paper's written, we would certainly distribute it. He thought it would be interesting to look at different types of management training opportunities for women in the profession and maybe try to develop some programs around that. Yeah. Okay, thank you again.